Alrighty, here we go. Louis the 14th. And good image to start with, very famous image of Louis the 14th. And this is our pure absolutism. And I'm going to go to our first slide here in a second, give you the key words you need to know. And definitely watch all the way till the end of this because it is going to give you many examples of what a pure absolute ruler is all about. And that's what you want to know, right? It's not enough just to say, well, France became an absolute system. I'm going to say, well, all right, if you have an essay topic on this or something, give examples, right? What are the examples to support it? And I'm going to give you quite a few in this lecture here, so you want to make sure to note them and know them. And so let's start with our slide here and kind of talk about Louis XIV. Just kind of remember this image of him as well, because just look how the dress very grand and big and everything. But we'll get into some of this as we move forward. All right, so these are key words, and we're going to go through all of this. And what I really again want to focus on is these are all going to be really good examples of what pure absolutism is all about. And the first thing you see there is the name. You don't have to write them all down at once. You maybe want to just write them down as I'm going through them. But eventually you need to get all these terms down. Is Louis XIV. And notice the dates. Now, as I've always said, you never need to memorize dates in my class. That's not what history is about. You don't need to know he ruled from 1643 until 1714 and all that. That's no. But what I do want you to notice is the amount of time, right? This is decades, guys. This is, I think, like 70 some years if you do the math. We get tired of our presidents 4 or 8 years, like go away, right? Can you imagine having the same ruler for like 70 plus years? Given that he actually started when he was very young. He was only 5 years old when he inherited the throne. And so this is going to be an issue. And this is also kind of the final step that allows absolutism to develop. Because obviously, when he's that young, he has to have a regent as well. And his regent is a man named Mazarin. And Mazarin, it's very interesting. If you're living in France, it's 1643. You've gone through the Richelieu thing and Louis XIII, and there are a lot of people who are kind of reading the writing on the wall, and they could see this kind of absolutism rising. There's some nobles who are unhappy. There's some Huguenots who are unhappy. There are a lot of people who are kind of not happy. And then you see, well, there's a new king, and he's only 5. It's a good time to strike, right? It's a good time to say, you know what, I'm going to rebel. And so what we know happens very early in the reign are these frondes, right? And this fronde, the next term there, is these rebellions against the absolutism of France, right? Against Louis XIV when he's a child. Mazarin puts those frondes down. And I've done some reading on this in the past, and it's kind of interesting, the different perspectives on all this, because when these rebellions or these riots, whatever you want to call them, take place and they fail, that's kind of the last hurdle to against any sort of opposition to absolutism in France. That's it. When Mazarin succeeds in stopping those rebellions, there's really nothing else to keep Louis XIV, once he becomes an adult, to being this pure absolute ruler. Now, one reading I did on this, and I honestly, it was read a while back. I don't remember the author. I wish I still had the book and the author in front of me. But the idea was that the frondes actually helped argue. The argument was it helped the development of absolutism because people wanted order and stability. And people don't like going to this place and that place, and there's riots and people looting and this and that, and conflicts, and people like order. And one idea that I read on this once is that, ironically, the attempts to get rid of this kind of reign of this family may have strengthened it. It's an interesting interpretation. But regardless, we definitely see Louis XIV starting to emerge, after these rebellions. And of course, Mazarin eventually dies, and Louis XIV is fairly young. And he's, early 20s, I believe, at this point, when Mazarin dies. And at that point, Louis XIV is pretty much ready to rule on his own. And that's it. Now we've got pure absolutism. So what are some examples, and this is the key part I want you to know here, what are some examples of Louis XIV's reign that show pure absolutism? Well, this term you need to know right away is divine right, right? This phrase divine right. And what does that phrase divine right mean? Well, it basically means that God wills it, that God gives you the right to rule. And that's right in itself pretty powerful. That's an example of absolutism. It's also the things Louis XIV said and he did during his reign that show pure absolutism. One of his more famous sayings is "L'état c'est moi," which is basically "I am the state." Right? And if you think about that, I am the state. Not the people are the state, not the, it's the polar opposite of what you would think of during like, oh, we're pushing for enlightenment and democracy and all that, which is going to come up in future lectures. I am the state. I am the central authority. He said other things as well. Let me read you a couple quotes we have from Louis XIV. So to give you a feel of what I'm talking about, he says the following. Up to this moment, he says this after Mazarin dies, up to this moment I have been pleased to trust the government of my affairs to the late cardinal. It is now time that I govern them myself. You, secretaries and ministers of state, will assist me with your counsels when I ask for them. I request and order you to seal no orders except by my command. I order you not to sign anything, not even a passport, without my command, to render account to me personally each day and to favor no one. So you get the sense, whether he's saying "L'état c'est moi" or giving these speeches, that he's the one in charge. That's what I mean by an example of absolutism. A few more examples. His nickname, he became known as the Sun King. If you think of the sun, it's powerful. It's the center of the solar system and everything, right? And so just taking that as a nickname is an example of his absolutism. I think just, again, the sheer number of years he ruled is a good example of his absolutism. One of my favorite things to talk about, and I think I'll kind of skip over this term, I'll talk about now, Versailles, which is the palace he lived in. And I'll come back to that in a second, actually. Let me go through a couple of these other ones because I have some pictures of Versailles, so you'll definitely want to know that. I'm going to give you more detail. But let me talk about these other terms here. Because these are also good examples of absolutism. These terms, lever and coucher, what are these words and how do they show absolutism? Guys, these were ceremonies. These are French words. Lever means to rise in the morning. Coucher is to go to bed at night. And these were ceremonies that people would go and watch. And, excuse me, and you would be able to be privileged to be able to go and watch the king get up in the morning, go to bed at night. It's very cultish if you stop and you think about it. I mean, can you imagine, saying, hey, I want to go watch the President of the United States get ready in the morning for his daily routine or go to bed at night? Who wants to see that, right? But this is all part of this. Another example of absolutism that you would want to know is that Louis XIV believed in one king, one law, one faith. Guess what happens to that Edict of Nantes? It's going to be revoked. And so now if you're a Protestant in France, you are out of luck. And they don't have the military, the arms to do much about this. So this was a very harsh and difficult time for Huguenots in France. But again, this is an example of this kind of absolute rulership. There is no sharing power, right? When you're an absolute ruler, you just do what you want to do. You do it unilaterally. You don't, know a concept of checks and balances. I am just going to order this and so be it. And he's able to get away with it. There is a parliament in France, we're going to talk about it later, something called the Estates General. And this Estates General, they're not even going to meet during the time of Louis XIV, right? And that's going to lead to a whole other story because eventually the Estates General will meet, and that's going to lead to tremendous chaos as you're going to end up seeing in France, right? This is going to transition us to another pretty big event later on. But these are all some really good examples of when it's not enough to say, well, Louis XIV is an absolute monarch. You want to give examples, right? And so whether it's his statements, his nickname, these ceremonies, the cramping, going down on the rights of the Huguenots and so forth, and not having any sort of checks with anybody else, all of these are good examples. There's another one that's maybe one of the more famous, which is this little palace that he develops, a little place called Versailles. I've been there. It's stunning. And I think I'm going to read you some statistics on it first. It's not in Paris. It's, if you get on a train ride, it's about, I don't know, 45-minute hour train ride from Paris. And he builds this magnificent palace there. And I'm going to read you some statistics on it. Then I'll show you some pictures. And you'll get a real sense of this is an example of absolutism. It's just designed to show his power and to show and show off. Hey, don't mess with me. Look at my palace, right? So there's some statistics first and some pictures. And you don't need to you could jot some of this down, but as long as you have the idea, you're fine. The whole thing is 2,000 acres in size. There's 200,000 trees. There are 50 fountains. I'll show you a couple pictures of these. 620 fountain nozzles. There's 52,000 square meters of floor space, 2,100 windows, 700 rooms, 67 staircases, 6,000 paintings, 1,500 drawings, 15,000 engravings, 2,100 sculptures, 5,000 items of furniture and objects d'art, and there's apparently over 150 variety of apples and peach trees in case you get hungry. So, that's pretty dramatic, right? And that's where he lives. That's his home. And he wants nobles there. He wants people to see it because he wants the nobles to see this, to keep an eye on them, to show off his power. Don't mess with me. Look at my palace. And let me show you some images of Versailles too. As hopefully you got all these keywords down now. By now you should have. But just show you some images to show you what I'm talking about in terms of his strength. So this is just a courtyard of Versailles. So that's one particular image we have. Here's just one of the gardens that you have there. Just these beautiful, beautiful gardens there. This is inside of Versailles. Obviously, it's what's called the Hall of Mirrors. It's one of the more famous parts of the Versailles. When I teach this in class, I found a site that has this 3D, 360-degree view of it, and you can probably find it if you want. And you go and you see it's stunning. It's absolutely mind-blowing. So you have that. So again, all of this is showing the ostentatious nature of where he lived, his palace. This is just one example of the fountains that I talk about. So they're really big, really magnificent. So all of this is part of absolutism. So, definitely kind of know that as a good example. What else can Louis XIV do to show his absolutism? And one of the other things a lot of monarchs like to do to show their power is fight wars. So let me go to our next slide here. So here what we're seeing is Louis XIV attempt at conquests, right? Fighting wars and trying to show his power. And he conquers a little bit of land. He gained this map kind of shows some of the areas he gained. And you don't need to know the detail on this being just a kind of a survey course. I'm not expecting to know every single detail on this. If you're taking an upper division course, you get into all the nuance of all this. But he does try to fight these wars. So this is, I think, the most maybe fascinating part of this whole story. All the stuff you want to know, it's all important. But at the end of the day, we get to 1714, 1715. Louis XIV is basically on his deathbed. And he is ruled as this pure absolute ruler. But one of the most interesting and ironic, important points of this whole story of Louis XIV, the rise of absolutism, Louis XIV, is in creating this pure absolutism, Louis XIV also has another important impact. Basically bankrupts France. And when he does this, he alienates a lot of people. And the same guy who is this pure absolute ruler, many people can make the argument he's also one of the first causes of the end of absolutism and the rise of what will become the French Revolution. Now, I read to you earlier, when Louis XIV came into power and now he said, I don't want to share power with anybody, blobbity, bobbity, boo. Well, listen to this part. This is just stunning. Louis XIV is going to outlive his son. He's going to outlive his grandson. So he calls his great-grandson, the future Louis XV, to his side and says, I want to talk to you. And this is the account we have of what he tells his great-grandson. Listen to this. He says this. Soon you will be king of a great kingdom. I urge you not to forget your duty to God. Remember that you owe everything to him. Try to remain at peace with your neighbors. I loved war too much. Do not follow me in that or in overspending. Take advice in everything. Try to find the best course and follow it. Lighten your people's burden as soon as possible and do what I have had the misfortune not to do myself. It's like a deathbed conversion. Well, okay, it's pretty interesting that he kind of gets this at the end and he tells his great-grandson this. The problem is his great-grandson is pretty young. He's, I think, 5 years old himself, and he probably just wants to go out and play. And he's not paying much attention. And so guess what? Not much is going to change. The overspending is going to continue. Bad decisions are going to continue to be made under Louis XV and Louis XVI, and then boom, it's all going to explode in the French Revolution, which is, of course, going to be another lecture down the line. So those are the stories of absolutism. I hope you find all that interesting. Now, we're not completely done with this lecture. What I do want to do very, very briefly is just talk about Eastern absolutism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to just kind of briefly mention it just so you're familiar with it. There's more in your textbook and so forth on that. But I do want to just talk a little bit about Eastern absolutism in just a couple quick slides here, okay? All right, so let's move on, and then, just kind of a little quick separate topic, but I'll just kind of include it in the same lecture here. So keywords, Eastern absolutism. You can go ahead and jot all these down. There's only one guy I'm going to talk about. Again, this is more. I do this briefly because there's a lot of good information in your textbook on it, but I do want you to know about this at least a little bit. And it's basically the stories of, 3 countries: Prussia, Austria, Russia, these Eastern absolute monarchs. And this term Junkers is spelled with a J, but I believe it's pronounced Junkers actually. Over here is associated with Prussia, and then this guy named Peter I, who I'll talk about as well. So, absolutism, you don't share power, right? Eastern absolutism, well, it's in the eastern part of Europe. How is it different than absolutism? It's, they rule through divine right, but there's kind of, at least in somewhere like Prussia and Austria, an element of, we got to understand we need to somewhat work with the nobles. And so, for example, the Junkers in Prussia, they were nobility in France who were oftentimes given tax privileges and given the rights to more influence and rights. And this was done to kind of, make them happy, right? To keep them content. So there was at least some element in places like Prussia and Austria during this time to maybe share power a little bit more than what we saw in France. Russia is an interesting situation with Tsar Peter I, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me and again, mainly I want you to read in your textbook about this stuff, but let me kind of go to our next image here. This is Peter I, and Peter I, fairly young when he comes into power. And when Peter I comes into power, he's basically a contemporary of Louis XIV, right? And he basically wants to be like Louis. The story goes that when Peter was young, he would go over to the West. He would kind of go in disguise, pretending to be an average person or a merchant, and go and see what people were like doing in France, and then come back to Russia and say everybody's got to do the same things that they're doing in France. And he's trying to be this absolute ruler. He really wanted this notion of being, as absolute as possible. He builds things in Russia that if you see images of it, you go, oh, that looks like Versailles almost. So let me kind of go to another couple slides here. So here, look at this. This is actually a museum in Russia, and it looked like it could have been taken straight out of Versailles, if you look at the artwork and stuff. So this is what I mean, like he's only 17 when he comes into power, right? I believe the exact year was 1689 when he came into power. yeah, 1689. And again, this is during the reign of Louis XIV. So he's like, I want to be like Louis. So it's very interesting that Russia, we see this happening in Russia. And, I'm going to talk more about Russian history in some other lectures moving forward, but we'll eventually talk about a woman named Catherine the Great of Russia, and how, Russia is going to take a very different path with things than in France. And it's in part why Russia doesn't have a big revolution and France does. And Russia's revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, happens many years later. But that's going to be stories for other days. So that's where we are in terms of Peter the First. Just a few quick little things that I wanted you to know about him. Really more in your textbook and in reading on him. I try to make sure you're reading some of the book and my lecture material. So for the Eastern Absolutism, if you're reading your book, you're fine on that. Remember, for quiz questions, I'm not going to draw some random quiz question from your textbook, right? But if you have an ID or there's an essay topic, remember it's all, open note, open book, and you'll get the IDs and the essays ahead of time, right? You're going to have plenty of time to read your books and figure it all out and sort it out. And you can show me things if you want as well. You'll be able to read your book. And, if I say, hey, there's an ID on Peter the First, you can read your book, add things, show them to me if you're not clear on any of it. So just, always be aware I'm always there to help you with that stuff. But I do want you to do some of that. So let's just go to our final image here. Just again, our map. And, the question is what's next, right? So we talked about the rise of constitutional monarchy, and then we talked the rise about absolutism and the different forms of monarchies, and this is just our map of Europe. But as all of this is happening, there's other things happening in Europe, right? There's other things non-political happening in Europe. Things like, we're getting into like the scientific revolution and all these kind of other pretty exciting stories as well. And then, of course, we're going to continue on politically what's going to happen. So there's quite a few different things that we still have to look at in terms of what's going to end up happening next in our stories here. All right, so I hope again all that's clear, and when you start to get review sheets and IDs and essays, use your book, use my lectures, always ask me if you have questions, and that's it, right? Hope everyone's doing well and following everything pretty clearly. That's it. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.